Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
Good evening, everyone. If you enjoy our show and find our research both interesting and informative, please can I ask that you consider leaving us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Something that small really does help us out a huge amount. You can also find out more about us and our work by heading over to deadsouls.co.uk and checking us out. We are a small team of 3 researchers with more than 70 years of experience between us. You can also find us and speak to us over on Instagram. Just search Dead Souls Social Club and we'll come up. So, as always, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This audio presentation contains graphic details of death, violence, and controversial subject matter. Listener discretion is strongly advised. From Dead Souls Media, this is Demons and Deception. I'm Jamie Black, a researcher and psychologist, and I'll be your host for tonight.
It's the kind of house they don't build anymore. A relic of a time when the world wasn't in such a hurry, when there was still time for a little charm and elegance. It has stood empty for a long while, and at the price, it is a bargain. For a growing young family, it is almost too good to be true.
What do you think?
I love it.
James Brolin, Margot Kidder, Rod Steiger in the Amityville Horror. 28 days after the Lutz family moved into their dream house, they were running for their lives. What happened to them is an experience in terror you will never forget, and you will believe in the Amityville Horror. From the best-selling book that made millions believe in the unbelievable, the Amityville Horror.
The quiet and tranquil seaside town of Amityville, located on Long Island, New York, is just an hour outside of Manhattan. And until 1974, it was an unknown and uneventful town. Quiet, suburban, and affluent. That all abruptly changed, however, when 6 members of the Defeo family were found murdered at their home at 112 Ocean Avenue on the night of November 13th, 1974. They had each been shot dead by a high-powered rifle as they slept. The family of 7 was survived by just one member, 23-year-old Ronnie Defeo Jr., known amongst friends and locals as Butch. He would later be charged and convicted of all 6 of the murders and sentenced to 6 life terms in prison. Ronnie died in March of 2021, still incarcerated in a New York prison. There is controversy to this day that surrounds the events of the murders, with many believing that the evidence shows that a single individual could not have killed all 6 victims in the manner that they died and in the circumstances which they were found. Furthermore, it was determined by the official police reports and the examining officials that none of the victims ever got out of bed once the gunshots began to be fired. That is with the exception of 18-year-old Dawn Defeo. To add to the mystery even more, no one ever reported hearing the gunshots that killed the family being fired. Yet 5 neighbours claimed to have heard the Defeo's dog barking wildly inside of the house at the time that the murders took place. 48 years later, and many still believe that Ronnie Defeo could not have executed all 6 members of his family alone, especially in the time frame indicated in the subsequent police documents, and that he must have had at least one other accomplice. some believe that there is evidence implicating Ronnie's 18-year-old sister Dawn Defeo as not only the accomplice, but the one who orchestrated the whole evil plot, before being murdered herself at the hands of Ronnie. However, the fact that Ronnie has told so many different versions of the events of that night throughout the years that have since passed has ultimately caused him to lose all credibility and damned him to a life behind bars. But the true horror tale doesn't end there. In court, Ronnie testified that he had killed his family after becoming possessed by Satan. A bold statement in itself, but 13 months after the murders, the home was sold to the Lutz family, who stayed in the house for just 28 days, upon which they quite literally abandoned the home and all of their possessions in terror, fleeing a horrific and chilling tale of demonic haunting and horrific evil within the house. Their story would ignite a firestorm of controversy and become known the world over as the Amityville Horror. Their story made the house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville the most famous haunted house in the entire world, and it became the subject of a best-selling novel and a hit Hollywood horror movie. It also produced a host of critics and non-believers who have been furiously debating the haunting for over 4 decades, leaving the true tragedy of 6 murdered victims as a briefly mentioned subplot. As an even further twist to the bizarre events, the house and haunting was investigated by the now infamous demonologists and paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. Yes, them of the Conjuring movies' notoriety. The events surrounding the mysterious Defeo Murders, as well as the Lutz family's horror story, are still much debated, and as such remain controversial topics to this very day. Many believe that the house was and will forever be haunted. Others believe the story to be a complete hoax, which has its origins in Ronnie's false admissions in court that were further elaborated on by the Lutz family in an attempt to make money from their time in the house. With all of the fanfare and hubbub, not to mention a monumental amount of misinformation surrounding this story, it is extremely difficult to separate fact from fiction. Everyone has an opinion about Amityville, and I'm sure each of you guys are no different. But tonight we are going to look at the facts and evidence and establish what we can prove. Tonight, in great detail, this is Demons and Deception, the truth about the Amityville Horror.
First, this bulletin from the WOR newsroom. 6 members of one family have been found shot to death in their night clothes in their expensive home in Amityville, Long Island. The only available information at this moment, according to the Amityville Village Police, is that the victims have been identified as members of the Defeo family. They were found by a 23-year-old son, Ronald Defeo, who is believed to be the only surviving member of the family. 6 members of the family found shot to death in their home in Amityville, Long Island. We will have further details on the 11 o'clock news.
This is a subject that I've wanted to cover for quite some time. In fact, I started writing and researching these episodes as far back as 2019. There are so many subtle levels to this case and so much nuance, and I think it's a fascinating subject. I honestly think that Amityville was one of the ghost stories, or haunted house stories rather, or however you want to phrase it, that I ever came across. I discovered it back when I was a young kid. Those of you who've been listening to the show for a while might recall that I have spoken about my late grandfather, who was a researcher into paranormal phenomenon. I think from sitting on the floor of his study as a kid while he worked, I picked up on the story of Amityville. I must have been around 4 or 5 years old. So the story kinda has a nostalgic kick for me. In fact, I have visited the Amityville house on a number of occasions, and it still remains, and still has, an aura, an atmosphere around it. Though I will add that the neighbours are not entirely friendly or welcoming, so I don't suggest paying your own visit. Though, and in all fairness, I can understand why, given the 40-year circus of intrigue that they have undergone since everything happened at the house, back in the mid-1970s. But make no mistake, They certainly don't make hauntings like this anymore. Just talking about Amityville will trigger emotions in many people. It may automatically cause you to roll your eyes or let out a sigh of frustration. It's a hot topic, even now. Some people completely dismiss the affair at Amityville as a complete hoax, a fabrication of events from start to finish, made up purely for financial gain. By this I specifically mean the events that happened once the Lutz family moved in. The Defeo Murders are, without question, a factual occurrence, although once again the specifics of what happened during those murders is also fiercely debated. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. However you look at Amityville, you can't deny that it's both an intriguing true crime case and also a strange and chilling paranormal incident. I think, like a lot of things, the truth lies somewhere amongst the grey matter in the middle. So let's try and bring that to the surface as best we can tonight.
Today, police combed the DeFeo's handsome three-story house for clues while divers explored the backyard swimming pool for the still unfound murder weapon. Police have been questioning the son Ronald and now say he is being, quote, safeguarded. Investigators say without explanation that they now feel young DeFeo was in the house at the time of the murders, but they're not yet considering him a suspect. And so forth.
No suspect at this time. We have no indication of the motive at this time.
What about Ronald DeFeo, the son, the surviving son?
Ronald is being safeguarded by the Suffolk County Police at this time.
Why safeguarded?
Why? Because the 6 members of the family dead, and we don't know why, and he's the sole remaining member.
Is he also a suspect?
He's not a suspect at this time.
Few people in the neighborhood knew the family well, but those who did described them as close-knit.
Well, I think they were just very sweet, very religious people, very family-minded people. And that's about all I could say. Very good, very generous, just type. Very close with their children.
There's one element in the usual mass murder story which seems to be missing from this case. There's no sense of fear in this community. No feeling of a mass murderer on the loose. People we talked to seem to feel that whatever was the motive for this crime, it had something to do with the family. It's not something that's going to return to bother anyone else. In Amityville, Long Island, Phil Barno, News Center 4.
Chapter 1. The Life and Times of the Defeo Family. The Defeo family were the living embodiment of the American dream. Well, at least they appeared to be from the outside. But like all white picket fences, there lies dirt and earthworms below. Ronald Joseph Defeo Sr., known to pretty much everyone as Big Ronnie, was born in Brooklyn, New York. This was also where he grew up and spent his formative years. In 1964, Big Ron moved his family out to Long Island. The area was safer. The quality of life for his family was far higher. It was a no-brainer for Big Ron. He wanted only the best for his family. Ron Sr. and Louise met when they were 2 young kids from Brooklyn. Ron Sr. was tall, thin and handsome when they met, and Louise, whose maiden name was Brigante, was naturally beautiful. She was thin with dark brown hair and emitted an elegant and classy presence. When she was younger, she hoped to pursue a career in modelling. Friends and family say she could have too. She certainly had the look. Before Louise met Ron, she actually dated Mel Tormey, the big band jazz singer. You know him from singing the Christmas song, the one that goes chestnuts roasted on an open fire. That romance was only brief, however, and she met and fell in love with Ron when she was just 19 years old. They married soon after, much to the dismay of Louise's family. To say that the Brigantes weren't crazy about Ron Sr. was an understatement. The Brigantes wanted so much for their daughter. They felt that Ron was crude, vulgar, and very obnoxious. He was big-headed. He liked to boast and was somewhat of a show-off. The Brigantes hated him. But Louise and Big Ronnie went ahead with their relationship and subsequent marriage anyway, tying the knot in 1951 when Ron was 21 and Louise was 20. Michael and Angela Brigante initially cut Louise and Ron off, disowning their daughter. But that only lasted a short few months before they reconciled in September 1951, following the birth of Ron and Louise's first child, Ron Jr. The Brigantes came around to Ron and eventually accepted him into their family. Following the birth of Ron Jr., 4 more children would follow. Dawn, born in July 1956, Allison in August 1961, Mark in September 1962, and the youngest, John Matthew Defeo, born in October 1965. It was a big family. Friends of the Defeo family said that Louise was a devoted and extremely loyal wife, and she loved being a mother. Her children were everything. She cooked a lot of Italian food and loved to take her children to museums in New York City to expose them to art, culture, and history. Big Ron and his wife searched Long Island carefully for their forever home, eventually choosing a beautiful Dutch colonial building in Amityville that was built in 1925. It was way out of their price range for Ron Sr., who was a service manager of a car dealership. But that's where Michael and Angela Brigante came in, purchasing the Amityville house that they moved into, furnishing it for them too, and including life-size portraits of each family member in gilded frames that adorned the wall of the staircase. The paintings alone cost around $50,000, it's reported. Big Ronnie had a slight, gentle smile and thick brown hair in the oil paintings. Louise looked elegant with high cheekbones and big 1960s auburn hair. Louise is wearing a red long-sleeve dress with a pearl necklace. I'll post a link to the images of the paintings in the episode description. It gives you an idea of the image of themselves the Defeo family wanted to project to the world. The house itself was situated on the waterfront. Amityville means friendly village, in a quote which is quite reminiscent of the movie Jaws, I think. A friendly village it was indeed. Being home to just 9,000 residents back in 1974 and situated roughly 35 miles east of New York City, the neighborhood was affluent, quiet, and leafy. The houses were large, the neighbors warm and benevolent. The Defeo family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue in the summer of 1965 and marked the event by placing a sign in the front garden that read, "High Hopes." This was a fresh start for the family, and High Hopes was a mantra that the family firmly believed was a signal for their future. The house was originally constructed by Catherine and John Moynihan, complete with 2 famous pie-slice windows on the side of the home on the 3rd floor. It's these windows which resembled creepy evil eyes when it was lit from within. It's an image that the later Amityville movies would lean upon to instill fear. The Moynihans raised their 4 children in the home and lived there until their deaths, when the house was sold on by Aline, the Moynihans' eldest daughter, in 1960. It sold for around $35,000 back then, an absolute steal by today's standards. The house was then purchased by Mary and John Riley, a young newlywed couple from New Jersey. The Rileys, however, only lived in the house for 5 years, when they subsequently separated and divorced in June of 1963. The house was around 4,000 square foot and sat on a 1/4 acre of land. It had a boathouse and private dock on the water to the rear. The village was wonderfully serene. Amityville was one of those old worldly towns at the time. They decorated the town for the holidays at Christmas and Halloween, had carol singers, a 4th of July parade, a bandstand in the centre of town, and painted wooden frame shop fronts. Street crime in the town was almost non-existent, other than the odd small incident here and there. In fact, locals joked that crime seemed more like something that happened over there in Manhattan, but not here in Amityville. The town was widely regarded amongst locals as there being no better place to raise a family. On the outside of 112 Ocean Avenue, it had dark shingles with white trim, and it was a long and narrow structure that was positioned sideways in order to fit comfortably into its lot. So in effect, it's the side of the house that looked out onto the main street. The front door faced side-on to the 237-foot-long driveway which led to the boathouse at the rear. The front door faced the next-door neighbour's side door on the adjacent property. The side of the house had 2 quarter-moon windows just below the roofline, which looked like a pair of eyes. These faced onto the street. It's the only house on the block where the front door does not face the street. The backyard had a tastefully decorated patio and a large heated in-ground pool. The two-story home was extremely spacious, included the aforementioned boathouse, which also combined with a double garage and an attic room that was so big it was considered an entire third floor. Within the home, there was also a full usable basement, living room with adjoining sun porch, a kitchen with central island and breakfast nook, 6 double bedrooms, a formal dining room, first and ground floor patio, and 2.5 bathrooms. It was quite simply a hell of a nice property. Today, in 2025, the property would set you back around a cool $1.3 million. But enough about property development for the rich and ridiculous. It's no secret that the family had money, but they didn't particularly flaunt it. Well, at least Louise and the kids didn't. Big Ron was another story. They had normal lives, the children rode their bikes around the neighbourhood, they played outside with other kids from the neighbourhood. They were happy, and they all got along and had a clear bond with one another, their school friends would recall. On the surface, the Defeos were your average white middle-class American family living in the suburbs. Each of the kids were well-adjusted, taking part in school activities and sports, and each having many friends. Except Ron Jr., but we'll come back to this in a short while. Dr. Paula Uruburu was a school friend of Dawn Defeo. In 2021, she said this of her friendship with Dawn, quote, "We first connected on CYO softball. We were in the softball league together, and she seemed like such a genuine person. She always had this, nice smile. She was always friendly. There were other girls who, because they were older than you by a year, they didn't really want to associate with you. But Dawn was never like that. We were just normal 13 or 14-year-olds having slumber parties or pool parties. There was nothing out of the norm." Unquote. These words paint a picture of normality, a family life like many across the town, state and country. Paula continues, quote, "The pool parties were fun, and there was nothing out of the norm. You would never think that there was anything weird, anything that would happen that would disrupt this, Typical suburban 1970s childhood. Dawn had a very round face, and she was just beaming all the time. And she had this really long hair that we always marvelled at. And we used to joke with her that when we were playing softball that it was going to get in the way, but she would never put it in a ponytail or anything. That was sort of her crowning glory." Unquote. Mark played on the school football team, and he was very into sports of all kinds, and cars. Whilst the younger son, John Matthew, was more sensitive. He liked playing with the family dog, Shaggy, and was very close to his mother. Ron Jr. adored his younger brothers, but his absolute favourite sibling was Alison Defeo. He was very close to Alison, and that was clear for all to see. She was very petite, intelligent, smart and organised, quite the opposite of Ron Jr. actually. She was 10 years younger than Ron Jr., but he loved taking her out on his boat, and she loved it too. At face value, the Defeo family appeared to have it all. They were a religious Catholic family, with plenty of money and plenty of finery. But whilst the family may have seemed to have everything on the surface, there was a darker side that lurked beneath the image they projected. The Defeos were, behind closed doors, a turbulent family. The Defeo family hid violent behaviours, emotional arguments, and heated quarrels. The arguments and confrontations increased as the children got older and grew more into themselves. With that came the physical violence. Unseen to the outside world, the Defeo family was on a downward spiral. The source of the violence and arguments was Ron Defeo Sr. He was a violent man who often fell into terrible rages. He was a control freak and didn't like it when family members disagreed with him. Arguments and dissension broke out without provocation, and Ronnie Defeo Jr. often took the brunt of Big Ron's wrath. So let's talk about this more, because it's integral to our story tonight. Ron Sr. had a very big personality and a reputation. Simply put, folks in Amityville did not like Ron Sr. The family had a reputation amongst the neighbours on Ocean Avenue. A lot of the fights and arguments were often overheard by those outside, and sometimes they spilled into the grounds of the house for all to witness. Neighbours recalled, most of all, that Ron Sr. and Ron Jr. would butt heads the most. A classic father and older son fighting to be the alpha male of the household. It's primeval in desire. Big Ronnie also fought heatedly with Louise, but she was a devoted wife and would apologise to Ron even when he was the source of the conflict. Louise would take Big Ron's side in arguments no matter what, and this irked Ron Jr. Big Ronnie had a history of getting physically violent with his wife too. She, like the children, was not spared his vicious temper. Big Ron was a big presence. He had a bolshy and chauvinistic personality. He was overbearing and controlling, and as the children in the family reached their teenage years and began to develop their own will and ideas, they often clashed with Big Ron, who wanted to maintain control over them all. His voice was big and loud. He was a bully, and friends of the family and the children in particular have said that they were afraid of him. But the same could be said about Ron Jr., who many considered a chip off the old block, so to speak. Rufus Ireland, who lived next door to the Defeo family in the early 1970s, said this about Ron Jr., quote, "Ronnie wasn't dealing with a full deck of cards. He was crazy, wild-eyed," unquote. Paula Uruburu noted the same in another 2021 comment. She said, quote, "There was something a little off about him, not just in a weird, he's my friend's older brother type of way. He was this loner and was really kind of not attached to the whole social aspect of the family," unquote. As a teenager, Ronnie Jr. was overweight and unhealthy. Because of this, during high school, he was regularly bullied and picked on by his classmates. It's likely why he developed the habits of a loner later on. Ron Jr.'s father encouraged him to stick up for himself at school and fight back. "You need to toughen up," Big Ron would tell him, even though Big Ron would never allow him to stick up for himself at home. Ron Jr. was used to being beaten by his father at home, then going to school and getting beaten by the school kids too. "My mother was always yelling and screaming," Ronnie later asserted in a 1995 prison interview. "It was a crazy house." On a number of occasions throughout his teenage years, Ronnie attempted to run away from home, but he was caught by his parents each time and brought back. The abuse at home began affecting Ron Jr. in a number of different ways. He began acting up, finally finding his voice and a confidence that he hadn't previously had. Almost overnight, Ron flipped from a quiet loner to regularly raising holy hell in school. Also, he quickly developed many problems with his teachers at Amityville Junior High. His grades soon dropped, and he spent most days disrupting his classes and posing a significant challenge for his teachers to control. It was around this time that others started calling him Butch, a nickname that even stuck with his own family. Eventually, he was expelled from Amityville Junior High, but he didn't care. The Defeos were worried about Ron's worsening behaviours and sent him to see a shrink in a rare moment of concern. Apparently, the root cause of the issues wasn't clear to Ron Sr. and Louise, so they thought throwing money at the issue would resolve it. The therapy helped Ronnie a little, but ultimately he got bored with it, stopped going and continued his out-of-control ways. Ron Sr., as you can imagine, was furious and sent Ronnie to a tough prep school in Brooklyn, St. Francis. But Ronnie got kicked out of there at 16 due to his behaviours too. He finally matriculated at Amityville High School the following year. No matter how much of a bully or how violent Ron Jr. behaved, his dominance was always eclipsed by his own father's. While Ron Jr. was at Amityville High School, he began taking drugs. This was when he was 16. He started out with barbiturates and uppers. He was a big kid and he desperately wanted to lose weight, so he figured this was the way to go about that. These, however, only led to more harder drugs such as LSD and heroin. Ronnie also hit the alcohol hard. He truly was out of control. So the Defeo's last-ditch attempt to sort their son out was by sending him to the military. Ronnie passed his military physical, and his father took Ron Jr. to Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. But suddenly, Ronnie was discharged without reason. It all seemed a bit of a mystery. It later emerged that Michael Brigante Sr. had paid the military psychology evaluator and draft sergeant $5,000 to keep Ronnie out of the army. More on Michael Brigante shortly. After this, his parents pretty much just gave up on him, choosing instead to throw more money at him and spoil him rotten, figuring if they gave him everything he wanted, then he would be happy and calm. By the age of 18, Ronnie had been hammering the alcohol and hard drugs like LSD, speed and heroin for more than 2 years. Ron Sr. gave him a job at the Buick dealership that he managed for his father-in-law, Michael Brigante Sr., thinking that he might straighten up a bit with some more responsibility. 3 guesses what happened. Yep, Ronnie slacked off, made up what hours he wanted to keep, and still managed to continue to take hard drugs and get into trouble. He was a chippy, for all intents purposes, a functioning drug taker. And even though Ronnie came and went as he pleased, he was still paid a consistent and generous salary. Ronnie, people said, always seemed to have so much more money than his yearly salary allowed, however. Ronnie didn't value money and frequently just pissed it away without thought or care. If he needed more, he would just ask his parents, steal it from them, gamble, or find other ways. One of those other ways was when, in November 1974, he decided to rip off his grandfather's car dealership. At 2:40 in the afternoon, Ronnie and a co-worker from the dealership were asked to take $21,900 to the bank and deposit it. A simple task that even Ronnie couldn't mess up. 2 hours later, Ronnie and his co-worker returned, claiming that they'd been robbed at gunpoint in their car while they waited at a red light. The robbery, they claimed, took place at the intersection of Cortlandt Road and Argyle Street in Brooklyn. It's right outside the Brooklyn Public Library. Even then, it wasn't exactly a bad area. Ronald Sr. was furious, because of course he was. He was immediately skeptical of their, quote, bullshit story. Ron Sr. may have had good reason to be suspicious, however. Ronnie refused to answer the police questions and flew into a rage when his father and the police tried to probe him for more information. Ronnie also refused to go to the police station to look at mugshots and help the police with their inquiries. He didn't help himself. He brought the suspicion down upon him, and this triggered future heated arguments between Ronnie and his dad, like they needed any further fuel on that fire. By November 1974, Ronnie Defeo, known to everyone as Butch, had a pretty shitty reputation around town. The locals avoided him. He was angry, violent, temperamental and foul. The folks of Amityville also knew only too well of his abuse for drink and drugs. It was no secret. It was also no secret of his penchant for firearms too, collecting several different types of rifles which he used for hunting. Al Ubert, who owned Henry's Bar in Amityville, said, quote, "All's Ronnie did was drink, gamble and fight," unquote. It was also well known by many Amityville folks that Ronnie liked to carry around a .38 caliber handgun, just to add more wood to the pile.
It was just very eerie, it was very quiet, and just a chilling, frozen moment, the kind that you'd never forget. It's a picture that you keep in your head always.
Before we move on, I'd like to briefly talk about the Defeo's oldest daughter, Dawn, as it may or may not be important later. I'll let you decide. Dawn Defeo had graduated from St. John the Baptist High School earlier in June 1974. She enrolled in secretarial school soon after. To quote Ronnie, "Dawn and my dad argued all of the time, and she'd began taking drugs to cope with years of physical abuse from him," unquote. Whether this is true isn't known. By this I'm referring to Dawn's drug taking. Friends have said they never saw her taking any drugs. Dawn did have a boyfriend at this time though, William Davidge. He was from Long Island originally, but had recently moved to Florida with his family. Davidge claimed later in a sworn affidavit that Dawn used mescaline and LSD. Dawn had a bad temper that Davidge claimed in the same affidavit. Paula Uruburu, whom I quoted earlier, was a friend of Dawn's from high school, and her memories of Dawn are different. She remembers her as a sweet, kind and caring girl, someone who got on well with everyone. Dawn's boyfriend, William Davidge, was the same age as Dawn, and she longed to start a new life with him in the Sunshine State. She desperately tried to get to Florida, and Davidge later said, quote, "She would have done just about anything to get out of that house, including riding with the devil all the way to Florida, if that is what it took," unquote. Dawn had a huge argument with her parents over moving to Florida to live with Davidge. In the sworn affidavit that Davidge produced, he wrote that Louise and Big Ronnie wouldn't let Dawn move away, and that was the cause of the heated argument between the three of them. This was only around a week before the murders, he recalls. It's worth mentioning that Dawn really looked up to Ronnie as an older brother. In fact, Ronnie looked up to Dawn too. There was a mutual respect there. Ronnie had actually said to the young children in the family that they should take after Dawn's example. She was going to secretarial school, whereas Ronnie had not even finished high school. She was academic, outgoing and very well-mannered. Ronnie, on the other hand, accepted and knew his shortcomings.
It's the kind of house they don't build anymore.
What do you think?
I love it.
A relic of a time when the world wasn't in such a hurry.
Up to this point, we've got to know the Defeos a little bit. An average white middle-class American family on the surface. A family that wasn't so perfect if you looked a little closer. A family twisted by abuse and intense sibling rivalry. There's a member of the family I briefly mentioned earlier that I wanted to come back to, however. That's Michael Brigante Sr., Louise Defeo's father and the person who had bought the Defeo their home and paid for it to be furnished and given Big Ron his well-paid job. Big Ron was indebted to Brigante, and psychologists suggest that this was the cause for a lot of the tension emanating from Big Ron. To an extent, he likely felt a little belittled or emasculated by Brigante providing all that he did. It was Big Ron's position to be the provider, yet it was all given to him and his family on a plate by the father of his bride. Internally, this could potentially eat at a man who is such a proud masculine controller like Big Ron. This would likely reveal itself in verbal abuse and physical violence to those he cared about the most, those who were able to see his internal embarrassment and conflict. Michael Brigante was a calm, level-headed man. Nothing seemed to shake him. While he probably didn't hate Big Ron, many who knew the family said that Brigante and Big Ron just tolerated each other. Brigante and his wife loved their daughter, and they wanted to maintain a relationship with their grandchildren too, who they also adored. People who knew the family also had other things to say about Michael Brigante and the Defeo family. That they had mob ties, association with the mafia. In fact, Big Ron's uncle was Peter Defeo, a capo regime in the Genovese crime family. A capo regime or capo is essentially a lieutenant or second-level boss in the mafia hierarchy. Neighbours of the Defeo family knew of their family connections. Big Ron, forever the braggart, made no secret of his family links. Further, Louise Defeo's father, Michael Brigante, was an associate of the Gambino crime family boss Carlo Gambino. Remember, this is the mid-1970s, a time when the RICO law was still brand new and only just introduced by President Nixon. The Italian mafia had significant power and influence in New York and New Jersey during this period. Amityville, and Long Island in general, was right in the heart of their territory. The mafia were feared, loathed and respected, which added further reputation to the Defeo family and influenced what other people who lived on Ocean Avenue saw, said and thought. Keep that in mind for later. In the next episode.
Only one person had access to a handgun, between my mother and father. He never got a chance to get it, she did. So everybody else was defenseless. Because I got to them before they got to me.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.